Okay, we've just had the recording turned on, so whenever you're ready.
Thank you. First of all, Dixie Ambulance would like to join in the representations made from the Hurricane Fire District. We've already been through that, but just for purposes of record, we believe that it's been improper to go through the revocation portion of this. But of course, the hearing officer has made that ruling. We just note it for the record. As we begin to look at what has been talked about in this hearing, we're talking about two things. One is an application for public convenience and necessity, and the other is a application for a revocation that would certainly result. The first thing that I'd like to remind the hearing officer is the burden of proof that is required for the applicant to be successful in their application. The burden of proof is upon Gold Cross Ambulance to establish the criteria that is identified in the statutes and rules of the state. The burden of proof then needs to be to prove the issues actually presented in the hearing. I spent time here and each evening reviewing the testimony of what has been presented in that day. I thought what I would do is, rather than go through the exhibits, certainly, Mr. Miller, you have plenty of time to go through, well, maybe you don't, but we have lots of exhibits, you have them in your possession. But I think it would be wise to look at what was actually offered. Mr. Moffett very eloquently indicated what Gold Cross was going to do. Gold Cross Ambulance is going to bring and stage 4 ambulances with 2 paramedics on the ambulances. In addition, Gold Cross is going to fix the difficult and terrible dispatch system that we have and make things all better. In the application, the language of the application is quite interesting, because what Gold Cross said through Mr. Moffett was, in the application, that Gold Cross intends to provide 4 ambulances and staff them with 2 paramedics each. I listened very carefully to Mr. Moffett's testimony, and he indicated that if they were to receive the application or receive the license, that they would staff those ambulances and then begin to negotiate with St. George City about the actual use of the ambulances, staging of the ambulances, and of course the dispatch. Now, as we review what Gold Cross's evidence has shown, most of the testimony, in fact, the vast majority of the testimony presented by Gold Cross to prove that Gold Cross should provide 911 emergency service to this community was based upon problems and difficulties that Dixie Ambulance had with its interfacility transports. It's interesting to note that as we look at the situation, Dixie ambulance got crosswise with Mr. Gary Stone. Mr. Stone from Dixie Regional Medical Center, in his testimony, did not challenge or say that the services were substandard by Dixie ambulance. What he said was the cost was too high, and he specifically said, "It is my feeling that they were not acting appropriately." Then he focused on the addition of a NICU transport. Apparently that's neonatal. And he focused on that transport and the fact that the Dixie ambulance got crosswise again with, if you'll remember, with the, and I didn't catch it for sure, but it sounded to me like it was the head nurse in charge of that specific endeavor. And yet it was reaffirmed that the interfacility transport contract allowed for at least 1 hour of response time, and if it was 30 minutes longer than the 1 hour of response time, that there would be fees charged by the hospital. Everybody testified that that had never happened. So we have a great deal of testimony from Mr. Gary Stone about interfacility transport. He couldn't testify about 911 emergency transport or emergency services because he's not in that department. He is an administrator of contracts and focuses on cost. And it's clear that his feelings, because he mentioned feelings a number of times, were hurt because Dixie Ambulance placed as a priority the 911 emergency services, and yet still fulfilled its interfacility contract. See, the reason for the response time being longer in interfacility is the patients are already in a hospital in a relatively stable condition, and at least according to Dr. Tremea, they're stabilized and transported, at least in this community, most of the time, about 1.5 miles. So Gary Stone's testimony has absolutely no application to the 911 application of Gold Cross. All it was an attempt to show that Dixie Ambulance weren't very nice. That's what it was for. There was no other testimony for that. Then we went to Dr. Kim Rowland. Seems like a lovely person. But again, all of his testimony was about interfacility transports. Every bit of it. And Dr. Rowland stated that he didn't have any great personal problems. He thought maybe that they were at one time a bit condescending. But again, it was over contractual negotiations for interfacility transport. So, thus far, with Gary Stone and Kim Rowland, it was all about interfacility transports. I'd also like to refer to Dr. Brent Mabee. Dr. Brent Mabee didn't add anything except that he thought Gold Cross was a good company, but he did not say anything about Dixie Ambulance because he didn't know anything about Dixie Ambulance. And remember, the burden is upon Gold Cross to show in a revocation, which again we dispute, but in a revocation to show that Dixie Ambulance has done something worthy of revocation. Secondarily, it is the burden of Gold Cross to show that Gold Cross's services would improve the entire benefit to the public based upon public convenience and necessity. We haven't got there yet. Now we come to Mr. Judd. Mr. Judd has worked at Gold Cross his entire career. Mr. Judd obviously does well with computers and with the circumstances, and I was impressed. I was impressed with Gold Cross's tremendous computer background and computer ability, and the fact that they have their own dispatch center. Now, I'd like to talk about their own dispatch center for a minute, because most of Mr. Moffat's testimony, which went on most of the morning on Monday, was about their dispatch center and the ability to collect data and the ability to collect information and the ability to do that because their dispatch center is so effective as it interrelates with the dispatch centers in Salt Lake City. And I believe that collecting data is important. But in this community, this specific community, we have a dispatch center that dispatches for an entire county except for a town known as Hilldale. The entire community. That dispatch center has been dispatching for these various entities for years. Mr. Esplin, and I'll get to him a little bit later as well, but Mr. Esplin made an interesting statement. He said, we've had problems in our dispatch center. He also said, specifically, Mr. Esplin was called by Gold Cross, he said, and I think this is very important, he said, I'm sure that many of the problems with response times has to do with our dispatch center. And that's when he said, if you remember, the fire chief, who testified later, came and asked for 3 more dispatchers. And he asked for those dispatchers a number of years ago. Over those number of years, St. George City has not yet been able to fill those dispatch spots. So, based upon the testimony, we have a dispatch system that is struggling, that is working as hard as they can, but who cannot produce the data in the dispatch center that Mr. Judd needs to very carefully do his statistical analysis. They can't produce the data because it's not available. They produce some. So, thus far, through the various witnesses that have been presented by Gold Cross, Mr. Moffat, Dr. Mabee, Mr. Stone, Dr. Rowland, and Mr. Judd, we have the following presentation. The system is not working the way it should. The dispatch system is bad. We can fix that dispatch system, and by fixing the dispatch system and adding 4 ambulances, we can improve response times. I don't recall any specific proof that 4 ambulances would increase response time. Indeed, the real proof is, and in fact it was eloquently referred to in argument just a few minutes ago, is that response time will be improved when communications are improved. In fact, to quote Mr. Sullivan, he said, the real problem is communication. Response times will be better. And that was referring to fully integrated communications. Now, I'd like to remind the hearing officer that within this community, there are other stakeholders. And those other stakeholders also have a claim to and at least interest in the dispatch system. The reason that Gold Cross thinks that they can do better is that they're going to get the license, stage 4 ambulances, and then fix the dispatch system and communication system for Washington County. If the problem with response times is as presented, and as stated by Mr. Sullivan, if the real problem is communication, then the appropriate process would be for Gold Cross to make a presentation to all of the stakeholders saying, we'll take over all your dispatch down here. That's not what is happening. Gold Cross is saying, we will provide better response times because of communication. We heard about these studies about 4 ambulances, and I believe that we were talked about dynamic staging. The study for St. George City about the ambulances was never presented and never discussed. Certainly the lead on this application is we're going to put 4 ambulances. And we're going to put 4 ambulances and 2 paramedics. But the evidence is the real problem is not Dixie Ambulance. And in fact, the real problem is not on response times, it's not even Dixie Ambulance, but it's the way the dispatch works and the way that the dispatch is handled. That's the issue. In fact, we'll move on to Mr. Overton. I love to see passionate people. And he testified that the entire system here is not only broken, but that the licenses and authority to operate should be removed from everybody. Dixie Regional Medical Center, fire first responders, because the system is wrong. So we now have Dixie Ambulance, who has been operating within the system that is here, operating with stakeholders all around, providing service, and they are supposed to lose their license because the other stakeholders, and particularly the dispatch problems, are their fault. Remember, the question was, who has the responsibility to fix this? Over and over again, it was the service provider. Well, we have St. George City, and that was the geographic area limited by the application. But remember, this affects the entire community. And one of the things that you need to take into consideration is the effect on other stakeholders in the area. The effect is, even though St. George City was selected, based upon the evidence that has been presented, the license should be revoked for St. George Fire. It should be revoked for even Hurricane. It should be revoked because they're suffering the same problems with response time, the same problems with data, the same issues that Dixie Ambulance is. Now, I want the hearing officer to try to recall any evidence about 911 care given by Dixie Ambulance in emergency calls that said that they were not providing good care. In fact, we have a letter in evidence signed by all of the ER docs, including some who are medical directors for other agencies, saying they're very pleased. The medical control stated that care is excellent So the burden is upon Gold Cross to show somehow that the care given and the service given by Dixie Ambulance is subpar. The only thing that is subpar thus far is the method of dispatch and the reporting of that dispatch. Now, if we look at, again, going back to Darren Judd, and this is just for a moment, even though there may be statistical problems, one of the things Mr. Overton said was if you have bad data, you can't get good information. Because we had some bad data and could not get good information, Mr. Randall went back and by hand went through all of the calls that affected St. George City. And you know, he didn't use a laptop. He used a pencil and paper. But he spent hour upon hour and did so and presented his study by removing the standby problems, removing the difficulties, and he took the data by going through all of those things during that period of time and generated, I believe it was Exhibit 75. Is that correct? Exhibit 75. His response times within the St. George area, after going by hand, and admittedly, human minds are not quite as good as computers, but by human effort, he came and he found out that actually their response times with Charlie Delta Echo calls within St. George City are better than 90% of the time within the standard that is 8 minutes and 59 seconds. Even though within the city of St. George there is no standard. Now I've thought about that, and I think it's important for you as the hearing officer to think about that as well. If it's very difficult to determine response times accurately from the dispatch data, even combining with Polaris, if that's very difficult, and you control that dispatch data, you control the dispatch center, you control all of those portions of the transaction, how could you demand a specific second-by-second response time because you're the one that has the data? St. George City has the dispatch problem. Dixie Ambulance responds, and responds quickly, and according to medical people on the ground, receiving the patients, evaluating the patients, they do so with excellent care. So, thus far, we've reviewed the evidence. Mr. Norman presented his evidence of financial difficulty with Dixie Ambulance. I can only say that through the process of cross-examination, I believe that Mr. Norman was holding so tightly to a difficult posture that he missed the point. The most that he could say was there has been a trend, and the trend is 2 years. No, 3 years, sorry. And those 3 years have been during a period of time of recession in this community and in this nation. I believe that the hearing officer certainly saw how Mr. Norman presented his evidence and defended his opinion, and I'm not going to spend much more time with it. except to say that I do believe that on a technical basis, a license does have some value. Indeed, Mr. Moffett and Gold Cross, in his testimony, said that they purchased the license together with equipment in Vernal, and they purchased the license for Utah Valley. Certainly, Gold Cross, with their excellent financial record, would not purchase something with no value. And if you add the license in to a simple QuickBooks program, that's all it is, a simple QuickBooks program, and couple that with the profit that has been made, I think that the question of financial viability and solvency is certainly resolved in favor of Dixie Ambulance. Some significant discussion has been held about the money taken from DA services and ran over the period of time to the owners in rents and so forth. There has been money taken, but there has also been the updating and replacement of equipment and vehicles. Indeed, the evidence is that as recently as the past few months, $250,000 has been spent and obligated for 2 ambulances. When a small business is operated, during times that are good, you receive compensation. During times that are bad, you back up. The financial ups and downs of our society are just that, they're ups and downs. One of the things that's been talked about is a couple of times when Dixie Ambulance has not been sure it could continue with the way things were. And that representation has been made. During those periods of time, Dixie Ambulance, through actually pretty good hands-on management, found a way. And found a way to make it. And now, because they simply were honest in their circumstances and honest in their approach, there's some kind of nefarious purpose that seems to be implied. That's simply a bit silly. Now, about now. If you had 75% of your business taken, I don't think anyone would be particularly sanguine that they would be able to continue. I've known Mr. Randall and Mr. Miller for many years. I've seen them do many amazing things. Perhaps they will be able to survive. Perhaps. But with 75% of the call volume, and remember, you can't charge for someone going out. You can only charge if you bring someone back in. And if you have 75% of your call volume gone, 75%, that will have a significant risk of loss. Now, coming back to, again, the burden of proof. I was very impressed with Mr. Overton. I was impressed with his passion, I was impressed with his desire, and I was impressed with his willingness to stand up and say this system must be fixed. But to then say that Gold Cross is able to come into this community with this many stakeholders and fix what he termed was a completely dysfunctional system is a little bit naive. Certainly, and Chief Stoker identified it absolutely. The issue is political. Well, what is the political issue that is apparent in the community? The maximum possible service at the least possible cost, and to try to balance those things. Now, if you have a recession and difficult times, and is that the time that you buy equipment, software, hardware, all the rest of it to communicate with a dispatch area that you can't communicate that way? Chief Kuhlman indicated that this whole area just was recently trying to get transferred over to 800 megahertz. And in the process, there were dropped calls, the console went dead, they tried to page out, it didn't happen. That's the system that we have. I doubt that Gold Cross has provided the evidence that says, we'll fix it. What they have said is, give us the license and we'll start. And we'll go and we are going to make sure that St. George City solves all of the issues. If the hearing officer will remember, I asked about cost. Mr. Moffat was very smart in his answer because he said, we'll pay the cost as long as it's what we have to do, but we'll enter into a negotiation for cost sharing. Cost sharing with all these stakeholders, with all their tight budgets. So, and the reason that they're going to take the license from Dixie Ambulance is because they're the ones to come from the north on their white horse and solve the problems that this community has been working with for decades. Mr. Overton's report may be something that we could work toward. But to blame it on Dixie Ambulance, that it doesn't make any sense. So where are we with evidence? We have the evidence from the party that has the burden of proof that says we are going to improve response times by giving you 4 ambulances without providing the actual studies. But what really is needed is not just the 4 ambulances. What we really need is to come and fix all the communications. In addition, we have the evidence that on interfacility transports, the people that were in difficult negotiations, that were involved in litigation, don't like Dixie Ambulance. Has absolutely nothing to do with the service that is provided by Dixie Ambulance for 911 calls. I haven't seen too many groups like each other very much after litigation, even if it is settled. That's the evidence for the burden of proof. That's it. Based upon that evidence, we take away the license, we revoke it. Now, let's come to the big question that has been here. Now, there's been discussion about insolvency and all that. I think we've covered that. I don't think there's a necessity for me to rehash it for many more minutes. But the big deal is Mr. Overton says it should be revoked because there are not 2 paramedics at the site of patient care from the get-go. That's what he said. We've had testimony from Captain Butcher and that Davis County does exactly what Dixie Ambulance does with 2 paramedics in 2 separate trucks. And I think it was Chief Kuhlman who said, yeah, and they qualify by waiving at the scene. So the definition of scene, I tried very hard to find anything that has defined it in the law or in rule. And what we have is, Mr. Randall said that Mr. Patrick said that the definition is anywhere from the point of incident to the hospital. Mr. Kuhlman said Paul Patrick said that to him. Mr. Butcher said that certainly Tammy Gooden and Mr. Patrick were aware, and I don't really recall if Mr. Patrick said it was okay to him. So there are three separate people, one very interested in this transaction, and another partially interested, and another that's not interested at all, who have testified under oath that BEMS has defined scene in a way that allows Dixie Ambulance to conduct their business the way they are. And in fact, if you notice, Chief Stoker talked about there were some difficulties with response time. And occasionally his firemen or fire people will say, we've been here a long time. He said, but we're a lot like everybody else. It may seem like a long time. But he said, we talked, and the times have gotten better. Do you know when they got better? When Dixie Ambulance changed the staging to the EMT and paramedic. And care is better. Response is better. Now, at this point, Gold Cross hasn't made their case on any level. They've made a great case on interfacility transport and that certain people don't like Dixie Ambulance. Okay? They've made a great case that response times are not verifiable and may in fact be delayed significantly because of the communications problems that we have. And they've made a case that that BEMS should revoke the licenses of Hurricane Fire, Dixie Ambulance, and certainly Davis County Sheriff. That's the case that they have made. Now, let's turn to our case. Mr. Miller. Mr. Miller is a good ordinary guy running a business, and they keep trying to do what's right. Do they make mistakes? You bet. Do they record things in the wrong columns? You bet. Do they try their very best? You bet. Is it sufficient to say that it should be revoked because of problems with accounting when you rely on a very simple QuickBooks program and it doesn't actually translate because of the complexities of Medicare and Medicaid and all those others? I don't think so. Then let's look at Mr. Randall. I think Mr. Randall said it best when he talked about being hands-on. Hands-on. He's there day in and day out. He carries the pager on his hip. He's not from northern Utah. He's not a hired manager. It's his business that he has worked in for many, many years. Now, this is kind of a crossover because we have established that Dixie Ambulance has quality, what is it, Q&A and Q&I. It has protocols. It has maintenance. It even has preventive maintenance. It has replacement. It has all of those things. Guess what the rub is? Some of it isn't written. Some of it isn't written. And yet, we have an ER doc in the ER who accepts the patients in from the transports on a regular basis and reviews the reports in real time while he's there. And if there is a problem, he goes back and fixes it. Granted, it isn't written. And granted, it isn't with a laptop sitting on the dashboard. But if ultimately it's entered electronically. And there's something everybody must be able to change improper data. Everybody, because no one is perfect. And the very fact that you have the ability to correct that data makes it actually more accurate. Now, we also have on patient care, except for people's feelings getting hurt over money in interfacility, we have no evidence about patient care from Gold Cross about Dixie Ambulance. Our patient care evidence comes from the people that give it, from the medical director who supervises it, from, I don't know, more than a dozen ER docs who say it's excellent. That's our evidence. There is no evidence otherwise. We have no evidence from Gold Cross that says that Dixie Ambulance paramedics are substandard. No evidence. What we have is that some things aren't written down, and Dr. Tremea talked about all of the education and all of the things that they went through. But we have no evidence that Dixie ambulances are substandard. On the other hand, we do have a medical doctor saying that the paramedics on interfacility transport that he has dealt with, there are some that weren't as good as Dixie Ambulance. Now, he may say that partly because he's the one that helps train. But he also made a point that there was one of the paramedics hired by Gold Cross on the interfacility transport that Mr. Moffitt says is so critical that it's just like 911 emergency, that was not capable and was fired and let go by Dixie Ambulance. That's the evidence. On financial data, we have a CPA who countered, I believe, Mr. Norman. And we have presented evidence of capacity, of improvement, of maintenance, of operating a business appropriately within this community. The issue, then, is 4 ambulances and improved response times. The evidence that we presented is that our response times for 911, once you take out all of the stuff that doesn't matter, are excellent. They're beyond the 90%. So, we now come to the 3 or 4 ambulances. We now learn that the cost, that the efficiency ratio, according to Mr. Overton, would go down with 4 ambulances. Aren't we trying to get the most efficient, the most bang for our buck? We also have Mr. Overton who drove through town for a few hours on a day. We have people in Dixie Ambulance who have been dealing with these situations for 13 years as owners and for years before that as a worker at Dixie Ambulance. So, what we have in reality is a promise of an intention to do better at something they haven't done than the people who have been doing it and working on it for all these years. And it's a promise of an intention. And what is the intention? We intend to put 4 ambulances and begin negotiations. That's their evidence. I was going to spend some time with revocation, but I'm not going to. I don't think that's necessary, because certainly there's no significant violation of law. I will do one thing. And I don't know how to really say this except this way. This whole thing about the grant is kind of chicken. Because Dixie Ambulance made a mistake by missing a deadline, even though they were under the understanding that that was okay. And that particular difficulty will be responded to according to the rules. And to make some sort of implication that there's something difficult and nefarious is just wrong. That somehow the people of this community have lost money that could go to them, it is suspended. It hasn't been finalized. And I think it's intriguing to note that Mr. Moffat is going to charge, Gold Cross is going to charge the same amount of money for St. George as Dixie Ambulance does for their entire license area. And that's how they're going to make a profit. If they're going to charge $4 million, $3,900,000, which is the same, and still make a profit, when they've reduced their collected income by 25%, something's not real correct there. You see, businesses need to make a little money. Good times and bad times. So Gold Cross says it can put 4 ambulances there and only charge $3,900,000 to the people. And they will make a profit of $70,000. And yet, what happened was, Dixie Ambulance charged $2,900,000 in the same area and made $207,000. So, at the risk of beating a dead horse, the burden is upon the applicant. The applicant has established that dispatch has some problems that affects response times. And they've established that they will fix it by putting the ambulance, another ambulance in place, 2 paramedics on, increases all the costs, and then completely revamping the entire communication system of Washington County, except Hilldale. That's it. The only other evidence is there are people who don't like Dixie Ambulance because they had a fight over money. Our evidence shows excellent, excellent care. And one last thing. I'm not going to do it, but if the hearing officer will please look at Dr. Maybe's testimony on the number of complaints. You're going to have to do a calculation, because even though there's 22,000 calls that Gold Cross goes on, and only 4,000 or so for Dixie Ambulance, Dr. Maybe talked about spending 10 hours a month to 40 hours a month dealing with their complaints. And Dr. Tremea talked about 10 minutes based upon the number of complaints. So if you do the math, I think it'll show that there's a different complaint factor as well. Finally, Dixie hasn't really had to prove anything. It was the burden of the other part. But I believe that we've established by all of the evidence that I've reviewed that this is really an application that should be denied. And I think that in addition, the hearing officer should take into consideration the desires of the population of this community and what is appropriate. In summation, in summary, Gold Cross is making an application based on a promise of an intention to do better at something they have no experience doing, and that is providing 911 service in Washington County, Utah, with the stakeholders and the circumstances that exist in this community.